we have colloquium day, so the semester just starts feeling chopped up. For example, I'm not going to see you guys for a week after this. I mean, I'll see you tomorrow in lab, but as far as lecture is concerned, we won't meet again until next Wednesday because we don't have class on Friday. We don't have class on Monday. What's that?
I didn't think about it like that.
Yeah, neither did I until applied stats, and I started thinking about due dates for stuff that I send them. I'm like, geez, I'm not going to see you between now and then. Um, so for me, and I don't know how you guys feel at this stage of the spring every year, but it becomes difficult for me to maintain focus to a certain degree because we're just so out of pocket. So just kind of pay attention to that as you're going through the next 3 weeks or so because it is a little disjointed with everything goes on. So next week is colloquium day on Friday, so don't forget that Thursday is actually not lab. Thursday is actually lecture. And so we won't meet on Monday, but we will then meet on Wednesday and Thursday. And then we won't meet on Friday. So it's just a lot of wackiness happens this time of year. So just hang with that. My hope is that by the end of the day tomorrow, as we pick up the models, so yes, I realize it has turned winter again outside. I just got a text from my wife earlier that says it was snowing in Lawrence. So we need to go pick up the models tomorrow. If it's cold, dress warmly. I'll have my car. I can drive. My plan is to drive out there, drop Mason and one of you at the beginning, drive whoever is remaining to the end, and everybody works towards the center, picking them up. You'll each have data sheets that show you what side of the trail they're on, etc. So that'll help you find them. You'll pick up the models, you'll pick up the flags. Each group will have 2 containers. One container for models that were not attacked and another container for models that were attacked. And you'll also have a data sheet with you so that as you pick them up, you can mark the data sheet as to whether they were attacked or not. So that by the time we come out of the field tomorrow, we will have the data in hand. What I'll do tomorrow afternoon after we get back is I'll tally up the results, send that to you so that you have the results as soon as possible. So that we can, and then I'll also run you through the analysis as well. Since we're not going to have lab the next week, I want you to have that analysis. So what I'll probably do is over the Easter weekend, I'll post a screencast that basically shows you what the data look like, walks you through the analysis and what the analysis means. It's a really simple analysis. It's just a chi-square test. And then you'll have everything that you need to start thinking about that report. I will also, by tomorrow, have a series of papers posted. One of the things that Rose and Chiara and I did was we did a pretty good dive on the literature about aposematism in caterpillars and about the way people have used clay models of caterpillars in the past to assess aspects of the morphology of caterpillars and how that affects predation. So there will also be, I'll just put a folder with a number of papers in there and you can start perusing those as well. Yeah, I think that's all. I've not even looked at your exams. I'm working on some written reports for my applied stats class. I'll get to your exams after I get done with those because I want them to have those back as well. So that's where I am in my grading pile. All right. So far, we've been talking about sexual selection. We've been talking about how differences in investment between males and females result in sexual selection, but also then result in conflicts over parental care. And we've also talked about how there are conflicts among members of the family in terms of the amount of care that they're getting. So parent-offspring conflicts, as well as conflicts between the parents. And conflicts between siblings, because each of those individuals have different goals in terms of how they attain maximum fitness. All of these ideas that we've been talking about, conflicts in terms of parental care, sexual selection, all of this also ties into the next chapter in your book, which is about mating systems. Luckily for Elizabeth, she's been reading about mating systems because that's what her literature review is about. But you need to not forget all that stuff that was on the last test material as we approach this chapter here, because all those things are going to still be relevant. So mating systems in general is an area of behavioral ecology that looks at how mates are acquired, how many mates are you going to take on, both for males and for females, and what the associated patterns of parental care are that are associated with these particular types of mating systems. So it's always good to start off with kind of a vocabulary of what we're talking about. So there's a table in your book at the beginning of this chapter that talks about the different kinds of mating systems. And they are monogamy, polygyny with a GYN, polyandry, and promiscuity. Now, a note on terminology. You will sometimes see that I talk relatively fast, and you will also see other times when I kind of slow down because I'm thinking more carefully about the words that are coming out of my mouth. This is one of those times when I'm going to be more careful about how I choose my words because of the way human beings, especially human beings in the United States, use language. So we have monogamy, which is, and polygamy. Sorry, there was one last one, polygamy at the bottom, or polygamy. Polygamy, I guess how most people pronounce it here in the United States. So monogamy is a situation where you have one male mating with one female, and this can either be over the course of a single breeding season or it can be more long term. If it's over the course of a single breeding season, so you're monogamous for this breeding season, and next breeding season you may be monogamous again, but you're monogamous with a different partner. This is what is referred to in the literature as serial monogamy. And there are other situations, though, albatrosses are an example of this, where you basically pair up with a mate and you return to that mate year after year after year after year. And these are oftentimes referred to as long-term pair bonds or permanent pair bonds. And so albatrosses spend most of the year out in the open ocean, flying around foraging. They generally return to, in many cases, a single island or a small subset of islands to breed. When they return to these islands to breed, they find the mate that they mated with last breeding season. They mate with that individual, they engage in parental care, and then after the fledglings are fledged, they then fly back out into the ocean to return the next year to the same island and presumably the same mate. And they continue doing this until one or the other mates is dead, essentially. So that's monogamy. Monogamy in the bird world, certainly plenty of humans engage in what we refer to as serial monogamy. Anybody who has been divorced and remarried is presumably engaged in serial monogamy. There are still some people who are engaged in long-term pair bonds among humans, but humans, just like birds, for example, have a certain proportion of the population that engages in extra pair copulations. So extra pair mating is as common in human beings as it is in birds, so it's not any surprise because that's just what many nominally monogamous species exhibit. Polygyny is when we have one male mating with several females in a breeding season, and this can happen in one of a couple of ways. It can happen by the male defending the female, so this would be female defense polygyny, or by defending the resources that females require, and this is referred to as resource defense polygyny. Females need resources to reproduce, and so one of the ways that you can basically gain access to females is by being a male who gains access to a resource that is important to females, and then having access to females as a result of that. So there's generally female defense polygyny and resource defense polygyny, and then there's also Lecking, which results in polygyny, which is a really interesting special case. And then there's also examples of scramble competition, which we've already mentioned a number of times. This is pretty common in amphibian species that have what we call explosive breeding, where all the females and males come to a pond and there's just a scramble for acquiring mates. Polyandry is just the opposite, and this is much less common for all the reasons that we've already talked about when we were talking about sexual selection. This is when a female mates with several males in a breeding season, and once again, it might do this by mating with multiple males simultaneously or in succession. And in this case, in almost all cases, the male is the one that ends up providing the parental care, whereas typically in this case, it's usually the female that provides parental care. But if a male is engaging in resource defense polygyny, he is oftentimes defending a resource that then attracts multiple females to his territory. But as a result of that resource being there and him needing to be there to defend that resource, he will frequently engage in parental care in this form of polygyny as well, simply because he needs to continue to be there to guard the territory that contains the resource. Promiscuity, there's no negative connotations in behavioral ecology to the term promiscuity. This is a situation where both the males and females have multiple partners during breeding season. Once again, this is relatively uncommon out there in the natural world, in the non-human animal world. And then polygamy is a very general term for when an individual of either sex has more than one mate. So you will almost always hear me in this class refer to things as monogamy, polygyny, polyandry, or promiscuity. I will hardly ever use this word, the word polygamy. Do you guys have any idea why I would avoid that word? It's too general, among other things. Have you heard the term polygamy used with reference to humans? Yeah, under what conditions? In virtually every case when it's used in humans, the word polygamy is synonymous with what a behavioral ecologist would refer to as polygyny. It is almost always one male with multiple females. It is hardly ever one female with multiple males. This is a bias in human language. If you're talking about polygyny, you should call it polygyny, not use a word like polygamy, which implies that, well, it could be either one. Could be one male with lots of females, or it could be one female with lots of males. Because when we use this in human culture, it's almost never polyandry. And I don't like these disingenuous uses of language. That's the main reason that I don't use this term, is not because there's anything wrong with this term. It's just a general term that when we use it in human, to apply it to humans, we almost are always referring to one thing and not the other thing. So I would just prefer to refer to the one thing or the other thing. It's not to say that polyandry doesn't occur in humans. It does, but oftentimes when we talk about it, especially in the news, we refer to people in Utah, for example, who are bigamous, who engage in bigamy. But once again, the gam at the end here is not andry or gyne. It's more general than that. This would be one mate with two partners, or polygamy, which is one mate with many partners. But in almost all cases, it's the male that has the multiple partners. So just clarification of language. Who are the most well-known bigamous and polygamous in, I just said it, polygynous and bigynous in the United States? well known for this, although it's outlawed in most states now. Do you guys know that bigamy and polygamy were outlawed, generally speaking? Tied to a religion? Yeah, Mormons are well known for this. At least a very small subset of the Mormon faith still practice polygyny, and in that case, it's always polygyny. Once again, it's not polyandry. So, so be as always, be careful with language, but in this case, be particularly careful with language. So, monogamy, polygyny, polyandry, and promiscuity, these are all different mating systems, the four major types of mating systems. Within that, we can look at different kinds of polygyny, for example. But in cases of polygyny, we oftentimes have the situation where the female ends up providing all of the parental care and the male doesn't provide any parental care. And your book presents a way of kind of thinking about the difference between female defense polygyny versus resource defense polygyny. So what we generally find is that resources can be dispersed in particular patterns. In some cases, resources are widely dispersed. In other cases, you will find resources that are found in clumped distributions. We've talked about this in terms of foraging, how the patch model, the marginal value theorem of animals foraging on clumped resources. This dispersion pattern then affects the clumping of females, where females go. Predation also factors into this. If predation is high, it might be more likely that you would want to cluster in a group, because one of the advantages of group living is the reduced incidence of predation. So we're not only going back to sexual selection chapter, but we're also going back to this group living chapter. So predation, if it's high, it might encourage the clumping of females, which then might influence the availability of females to males. And then there's this issue of the cost and benefits of social living. We talked about the benefits of social living are that it might lead to decreases in predation rate for the individual, and it also might make food abundance more available. But one of the costs, or a couple of the costs of that, is that large groups, large aggregations may actually attract predators, leading to higher rates of predation. And if you're living in a social environment, you have to actually share the resources that you have. So even though there may be more food available, there might also be more competition for food. So there are costs and benefits to living socially. And all of these things will influence how females are dispersed. If resources are dispersed, you might expect females to be dispersed. If resources are clumped, you might expect females to be clumped. If there's high predation, you might expect females to be clumped simply because there's strength in numbers, there's safety in numbers. If predation is less likely, you might find that females are more dispersed because they don't have to suffer high risk of predation, and they don't suffer the negative consequences of social living, things like having to compete more for food and things like this. So these three factors are important in determining female dispersion, where females are and how many of them are there. Then once the females are dispersed, males can simply compete for access to these females directly. And this is where we have female defense polygyny. So in this figure, arrow A refers to female defense polygyny. If resources are clumped, predation is high, and the benefits of social living outweigh the cost, Females will clump in space. That will then provide a resource of females that males will then compete for in order to gain access to those females. And so he will defend those females against other males. A more indirect way of doing this, though, is for the male to simply identify what it is that is leading to female dispersion patterns, attempt to monopolize that resource that is affecting the the distribution of females in the landscape, and as a result, they orient themselves in space so that they control a resource that females want to get access to those females. So it's a more indirect, roundabout way. B in this case is resource defense polygyny. You don't try and control access to the females, you try and control access to the resource, and once you have control of that resource, the females will come to you, essentially. So these three factors are the factors that ultimately matter. How resources are distributed, whether predation is high or low, and whether the costs of living in a group outweigh the benefits of living in the group, or the other way around, the benefits outweigh the costs. So, like I said before, if you have a widely dispersed pattern of females, polygamy is not as likely. Polygyny is not as likely. Once again, I've gone through this process of wanting you to distinguish between polygyny and polyandry. But once again, this is a figure from your book, and they use the more general term polygamy. But once again, we're talking about polygyny in this case. When females are dispersed, there's little polygyny potential because they're too widely dispersed for a male to control access to them. But when those females are patchily distributed, either because resources are patchy or because predation rates are high, you have a high potential for polygyny to occur. So this always has seemed in the past a difficult situation for students to wrap their heads around. So a couple of iterations ago of this class, I tried to come up with a way of thinking about this. So what I've done is I've created kind of a flow chart that breaks this thing down into the relevant things that are important. So for resources, you can have dispersed resources or clumped resources. Then within that, you can have predation that is either high or low. And you can have high predation and dispersed resources or low predation and dispersed resources. You can have clumped resources that have high predation and clumped resources that have low predation. And then within each of these, there's the cost-benefit ratio of living socially. A cost-benefit ratio that is greater than 1 means that the costs are higher than the benefits. Usually, if the costs are higher than the benefits, you would avoid living in a group. If, on the other hand, the benefits are higher than the cost, which is what the cost-benefit ratio is when it's less than 1, then there's more encouragement to live in a group because the benefits outweigh the costs. So for each of these two combinations, there's either cost-benefit ratio where costs are high or cost-benefit ratio where benefits are high. Costs are high, benefits high, costs are high, benefits are high, costs are high, benefits are high. So these are all the possible combinations of these different traits. So you can think about this in hopefully a productive sort of way. So for this first combination, we have dispersed resources. Dispersed resources would tend to do what to female dispersion? Would it make it more clumped or more dispersed? So you would expect to see dispersed resources leading to dispersed females. If predation is high, then what would you expect that to do to the distribution of females? You would expect females to be clumped. So we have these contradictory sorts of forces tugging at one another. So if resources are dispersed, if predation is high, we would expect dispersed females on the basis of resources. clumped females. But then if the cost-benefit ratio is, in this case, greater than 1, the cost of living in a group is higher than the benefits that you receive from the group. In this case, because predation is high, it's probably not due to predation, but it's probably due to competition for food. You would tend to see females doing what? You would expect females to be more dispersed. And so what you might predict out of this is there's more things pushing the females to take on a solitary sort of existence, a more dispersed existence. That solitary existence in females are going to, in this case, be solitary. So what would you expect to happen with reference to polygyny? Would you expect to see polygyny, or would you expect to not see polygyny? You would expect not to see it because the females are dispersed. So low polygyny. What was on the last figure? Potential. Your book refers to it as polygyny potential. Now, if resources are dispersed, predation, on the other hand, is low. If predation is low, we would expect dispersion. And if we also have a cost-benefit ratio, though now, where it's less than 1, meaning that it's beneficial to be in a group, you might expect also dispersion, or solitary females. And whether they're solitary or live in a group might depend upon what the equation is actually on this cost-benefit analysis. If the benefit is much greater than the cost, then you might actually see some sociality, but generally we would expect to see solitary females, once again with a low polygyny threshold. And so I have, why do I have that? That's wrong. Should be leaning towards solitary, not social. That should be bolded solitary and less bold social. I don't know why that's on there. Let's just fix that now. And then I will resave this. This should be bold, and this should be unbolded. My bad. Whoa, wait a minute. Oh no, I'm sorry, I got it wrong. I put predation low. Duh. Let me go back. This is supposed to clarify, and all it's doing is confusing because I'm losing my mind. Put that back to bold. Why do I keep erasing that when all I want to do is change it? Sorry, I changed one of these and I didn't mean to change it because I'm not following the branching diagram. When we have dispersed resources and predation is high, this would make you dispersed, this would make you clumped, but then when the cost-benefit ratio is high, it would tend to make you want to be clumped because the cost of social living isn't very high relative to the benefit. So you have clumped plus clumped, which would make you want to be more towards social. In which case you have higher polygyny potential. Dispersal is dispersed, predation is high. That would tend to make females want to hang out together. And when the benefits of social living are high, it would make females want to gather together. leading to sociality among the females, which leads to high polygyny threshold, or high polygyny potential, which is why you might see solitary situations, but you're more likely to see social situations, and then that would lead to high potential for polygyny. Now, we can go to dispersal. Let's actually just erase all of this. Highly dispersed resources, predation low, cost-benefit ratio is greater than 1, meaning that costs are higher. Costs of living in a group are high. Dispersed resources would lead to dispersed females. Predation low would lead to dispersed females. High cost to group living would lead to dispersed females. Under these conditions, there's no reason on earth why females should be hanging out with one another. So this should be definitely solitary individuals. Once again, leading to a low possibility of polygyny. And you can go through the whole rest of this thing. If resources are dispersed, predation is low, that would tend towards dispersal, but you would have now a cost-benefit ratio that is less than 1 because the benefit is higher. Whether or not you're solitary or dispersed might depend upon what the inequality here was like. If benefits are way better than the costs, you might expect that to be enough of an incentive. So once again, I would probably say that you're more likely to be dispersed here than social. And once again, I'm not sure why that's not bolded. But under this situation, because of the dispersal of resources and low predation, in spite of the cost-benefit ratio being skewed towards the benefit, you would still expect females to be on the solitary side. Once again, low polygyny threshold. And you can go through this the rest of the way and essentially say, well, what would I expect? If resources are clumped, I would expect females to be clumped. If predation is high, I would expect females to be clumped. So clumped, clumped. And if the cost-benefit ratio encourages clumping because the benefits are high, once again, we should expect to see social females and a higher potential for polygyny. So as I try and think through these three characteristics that your book mentions, the dispersion pattern of resources, the relative risk due to predation, and the costs and benefits of living in groups, I would think about how these three things interact to affect the behavior of females, and then the dispersal pattern of females will then determine whether or not there's a high potential for polygyny. And this is not a bad way of kind of combining all this. In the end, you end up getting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different categories of behavior. But if I gave you an example of any of these, we could figure out what might happen. Yeah, and I'm trying to think of a good example, but I will think of a good example eventually of how you can apply these three things to any particular group of organisms. Wolf spiders. We've talked about wolf spiders. We talked about them in class the other day. Are resources, insects in the leaf litter of a forest, is that a resource that is dispersed or not? You find aggregations of insects, or do you see insects just kind of all over the forest, and especially on the ground? Yeah, you're going to find them all over. So resources are dispersed so that a given male spider can't really control access to resources. Predation levels in many of these forests are just other spiders, and so you might think that predation levels are relatively low, once again leading to dispersal among the females. And there's absolutely no benefit to living in a group with spiders. So if they were to live in a group, and more than likely the cost would outweigh the benefits. So we tend to see solitary females wandering around the forest with solitary males, and there's relatively low probability of polygyny developing. If it is polygyny, it's not synchronous polygyny. It's going to be polygyny where one male will mate with multiple females, but will do that over the course of many chance encounters with females, rather than a male engaging in either resource defense polygyny or female defense polygyny. So once again, we could take individual examples of individual species and work through what we would expect to see in their mating system by applying these three drivers of the mating system. You're writing a paper about this. Does this help you think through mating systems at all as you think about frogs and toads?
Yeah, most of the stuff I've not like gone over a bunch of times, like in reading papers. So.
Okay. So this idea that these three factors influence the dispersion pattern of females ultimately affects the defensibility of females as a resource. And so when we think about dispersion patterns of females, we have to think about whether or not they are defensible. So if females are living solitarily and that those females are defensible by a male, and the range of females is small enough, you might have polygyny developing because you end up with a pattern that looks like this. You have females that are living solitarily. They're reasonably widely dispersed. They'll have relatively small ranges such that a male can include them. Well, that's not male. A male can include them in his range. Then you can have polygyny occurring because the females, even though they're not living as a group, they have all such small activity ranges that they don't spread themselves out over a huge area, such that the male can still control access to them. This is where you would perhaps have polygyny evolving. However, if the female ranges were large enough for these females if females are living solitary existences but now have large activity ranges, the result of that is that they are even more dispersed. It now becomes much more difficult for a male to control access to those females, and so you would be more likely to have monogamy resulting as a result of it. If you have females that are solitary and the range is defensible by the male, then once again, what matters is whether it's defensible. So if it's not defensible by the male, then you can have what is referred to as polygyny that occurs not simultaneous, not what they call synchronous, in your book they call synchronous versus non-synchronous polygyny. If you have females with a small range, you can control access to a bunch of females all at once, and so you can have what's known as synchronous polygyny. But if you can't defend those females, what you might do is you might just associate with females while they're in estrus, while they're in reproductive condition, and then move on to the next female in reproductive condition and not spend much time defending a territory as much as you spend time searching for mates. And so think back to the situation when we were talking about dung flies. Those mates, a big part of what determined how long you would stay copulating with a female well, not a big part, but one of the things that they considered was not only the displacement of sperm by the male that was enhanced by the longer you were copulating with the female, the more sperm you displaced, but the other thing that they talked about in that paper was how much time it took to search for a female. And so this is one of those situations where polygyny occurs because males mate with females that are ready to mate with and then moves on to other females after he's finished with the first, because he can't control access to the female. If the females are social and they're defensible by the male, then you might have what we refer to as permanent harems. We see this in things like elk, where you will have a bull elk with a bunch of female elk, and he will travel around with them for long periods of time, maintaining those relationships with the females in his harem for long periods of time, in many cases beyond a single reproductive season. Simply because when another male elk comes along, they will fight. They will fight by clashing their antlers together, and whichever male wins that battle essentially takes over that harem, and the male keeps that harem until he's deposed by a rival male. Sometimes you will find males forming what's known in the literature as coalitions. A coalition is just a group of males who cooperate with one another to gain control of access to females. This will happen in some primates sometimes. Trying to think of other good examples of it. Strangely enough, something similar to this happens in humans. In certain parts of Nepal, there are situations where for whatever reason, the sex ratio is really skewed, such that females are not very well represented in the population, so there's a male bias sex ratio. As a result of this this female bias sex ratio, this male bias sex ratio in the population, it's a system in which the parents of females demand a dowry when you go to marry somebody, and because females are in such high demand, families with females can demand really high dowries. As a result of these really high dowries, generally a single male isn't capable of providing a dowry sufficient to acquire a bride. And so in this case, a coalition of males, typically brothers, will essentially pool their resources to be able to afford the dowry, and they will all end up marrying this one bride simply because of the cost of the dowry. This is, as far as I know, the only example of polyandry in human cultures where it's formalized like this. So you can defend a harem with a single male or a group of related males. Once again, this is going to be influenced in many cases by the sex ratio. If females are in high demand, you may be better off teaming up with your brothers to defend a group of females than trying to go it alone. So it all depends on the size of the female social group. If females are social and the range is not defensible by the male, oftentimes what happens depends on female movement patterns. And so in this case, female movements could be predictable, in which case a male could station himself at a position where he knows that groups of social females are going to be passing, and then take advantage of those encounters, just essentially waiting for females to show up. Male-male competition occurs for access to those sites where they know that females are going to show up, and whichever male prevails in that male-male competition for having control of that site is the one who gets to mate with them. If, on the other hand, the movement of females is unpredictable, oftentimes what you will see is two things happening. If females all come into reproductive condition at the same time, you will have seasonal harems, where a single male controls access to a group of females, traveling with them as they are moving around, but as soon as they are finished reproducing, the male will become solitary again. If the females don't come into reproductive condition in a synchronous fashion, males will wander around, coming into contact with groups of females and mate with females once again as they come into estrus. So the movement pattern of the females and the timing of their reproductive receptivity is what determines what the male ends up doing. So when we think about polygyny, what's the evidence to support these ideas? Polygyny is widespread in the animal kingdom. When we look at specific examples, we see voles, for example, where food is aggregated, females have small ranges. This affects the male dispersion pattern, and you end up with essentially resource defense polygyny because of the effect of aggregated food on the assemblage of females. Presumably, these small female ranges results in females being more closely spaced, but they're not so closely spaced that the costs of living close to one another is greater than the benefits of doing that. An experiment that they did with voles, they caged females to control spacing patterns, and then they tracked male movements, and males basically followed the movements of the females. Similar things have been seen in wrasses as well. We can look at comparative evidence from mammals, for example. 60% of mammal species have solitary females, but we also then have 40% that are social. In most mammals, you have the male mating with the female and then deserting, but in a small number of cases, males will defend the young or feed them. And so when we look at mammals, we see that solitary females will engage in polygyny, but in almost all cases, the male doesn't provide any sort of parental care, which basically, once again, pushes males towards polygyny rather than monogamy, because if they're not providing parental care, then there's nothing tying them to the care of the offspring. Questions at this point? Do you guys know what a lek is, or a chorus? Elizabeth knows what a chorus is. What's a chorus?
Like, I think that like obviously like frogs.
Yes.
Like sit around and like roast.
Yeah.
And a lek is like a big group of males that are like attracted to it. And then there were some pictures where they like smothered
Oh, in frogs?
like, yeah.
Yeah. So that's situations where there's scramble competition. Yeah. So a lek and a chorus is pretty similar, because what they both are essentially aggregations of males. And there are a number of reasons why these males might aggregate, and we'll talk about those in a few minutes. But the aggregation of the males themselves tends to be the thing that females are attracted to. And the way in which they operate varies a little bit between leks and choruses. But in both of these cases, there's oftentimes male-male competition for the position in the lek or the position in the chorus. So if you walk into the White Science Center from the faculty parking lot right now, you will actually hear a chorus of frogs. The chorus of frogs is further down the hill, and it's a good ways away, but the weird thing about White Science Center is you can hear the sound bouncing off the bricks. And so it sounds like frogs are calling from White Science Center, but it's really just reflected sound coming from this chorus that is some distance away. So with frogs and toads, the rains come this time of year. They fill up temporary bodies of water. The male frogs move to those temporary bodies of water. They start making noise. The chorus itself becomes a large enough sound stimulus that it becomes noticeable by females, and then females orient towards that sound and then go to where the chorus is. Once they are there, There's male-male competition for positions in the chorus, and females also can exercise female choice depending on which male they want to mate with. Oftentimes that's determined by vocal characteristics of the call emitted by individual males. In many cases, there are no resources that are defended at leks or choruses, but in some cases, at least, people have found that when they look closely enough, there are resources that are defended. And so, for example, in bullfrogs, people have found that the highest quality males actually gain territories that we're not sure why, but when females lay their eggs in that male's territory, their eggs have a higher hatching rate than other males. So there's something about that territory that is of value to the female in terms of increasing the hatching rate of their offspring, but they're not, biologists aren't sure what it is about that territory of that male. Have you read about this stuff? Yeah. Leks, in almost all cases of leks that I've studied, biologists have been very hard pressed to find what the resource is in a lek that might be valuable to a female. So let's see if the prairie chicken video comes up. Prairie chickens are a group of birds that occur here in the areas around Missouri and Kansas and throughout the Great Plains. Prairie chickens live solitary lives throughout most of their year, but during breeding season, males will come to what they call a booming ground or an arena, and they will start engaging in mating displays, courtship displays, and they will express these displays at other males, and the nature of the displays is that they're effectively competing with access to what is presumably the prime spot in the lek. Once they've been there for a little while, and you can actually, back in February and March, you could actually go to Konza Prairie, and they have tours where you can go out early in the morning and you can hang out in a blind at a lek and watch prairie chickens doing their thing. Over time, as these males are at the booming ground, females will come by. The females basically inspect the males, and they then choose a male that they want to mate with. And it turns out that at these leks, in most cases, one or two or three males at a large lek will basically get virtually all of the copulations that happen at that lek. So the females tend to agree on either who is the dominant male, the highest quality male, or they tend to agree on what's the best site within the lek, and they will then mate with those males. Because then when you do paternity analysis, you find that the bulk of those prairie chickens have been sired by one or very few males. So let's see if we can see some prairie chickens doing their thing. We can. That's a red-winged blackbird that you hear in the background. They're stamping their feet, wings are down. They make these hooting noises. And as they're making them, they're inflating these air sacs on both sides of the neck. They're brightly colored. See how big that gets? They fill it with air. The feathers separate, and then as it lets the air out, it shrinks up again. You see the flare of the tail feathers. Prairie chickens, yeah, the greater prairie chicken. This is them calling one another. Here now you see two males facing off. You'll notice that one male has his feathers that normally are down over the neck are elevated. The non-dominant male over here that is challenging, you'll notice that his feathers are plastered down on his neck. Let's go back so you can see that dude. Catch his neck when you see him on the left. Maybe I didn't go back far enough. Sounds like they're about to go at it again. See, that one pulls his feathers down first. So clearly, one of them is winning this particular contest at this particular moment. Submissive posture. He's doing his best, and that dude over there is having nothing of it. And they will do this for hours. Hours and hours on end. Once again, that one that had his feathers up now has dropped his feathers in the face of this dude who has his feathers fully extended. And over time, there's a pecking order that gets set up among these males where there's clearly one dominant male. That dominant male generally takes up a central position within the lek, and that dominant male usually ends up getting most of the matings. Now, back in the old days when you could do experiments by basically just shooting prairie chickens, there was an experiment where they did precisely this. They would sit at a distance. The researchers would sit at a distance. They would wait until all of this played out, and then they would shoot the dominant male, remove the dominant male from the lek, and then there was a fight among the remaining males for access to the position that the dominant male had been holding. And inevitably, it wasn't the male that the females were coming to, it was the position within the lek that the females were coming to, because whatever subordinate male took over that position in the lek is the one that then started getting all of the matings with the females. So there is something about the position in the lek, but in spite of a lot of people trying to figure out what it is about that position in the lek, people still have yet to figure out what exactly it is. And that is a smoking hot male. You can tell just from the sound of him. I've been to see these guys do the behavior is called booming, and I've seen these guys do this. I went a couple of years in a row to view this over at Kanza, and it's pretty entertaining. One of the costs of males doing this is, of course, they are making a lot of noise on a prairie where there's practically no cover. I was in a blind at Kanza one year when we heard a hawk evidently swoop down, grab a male prairie chicken, lift him up, land on top of the blind, and then proceed to kill and eat the prairie chicken while we were in the blind. And we couldn't see it because we were inside the blind, but when we came out, the remains of the prairie chicken were just behind the blind and the hawk had flown away. But there are costs to doing this, one of which is increased predation because you're essentially advertising your presence to all the prairie chicken females, but you're also then advertising your presence to any predators that are in the neighborhood. So presumably leks occur because males are unable to defend females or the resources that females need. In this case, in prairie chickens, the females are widely dispersed across the prairie, and they're out there foraging. They come to the lek and they mate, and then they immediately go back to wherever they came from in the prairie. And in this case, population sizes may make intense male-male competition too costly. And one of the things about prairie chickens is that they occur at low densities because they are widely dispersed, and they also don't have huge population sizes. As a matter of fact, I think most of the all the prairie chicken species in the United States are currently on either the threatened or endangered species list. So they're low density, low population size kinds of species that engage in this. Sage grouse are also a type of lekking species. We also have cob, which is a type of antelope that is in Uganda, and the white-bearded manakin is another lekking bird. And what you see when you look at the paternity of the offspring coming out of these leks, what you generally see is a very skewed distribution of paternity. In this case, when we look at percentages, one individual basically achieved 35% of all of the matings. In the cases of sage grouse, it's almost 50%, where the dominant member of the lek achieves between 40 and 50, and on the 50% side of all of the matings. In the cases of the white-bearded manakin, it's higher than 70%. So there's something about the dominant individual in the lek that females are cluing into as representing quality, but once again, biologists have just been hard-pressed to identify what exactly that is. We've talked about elephant seals. Elephant seals are the same way. The beach for a bunch of elephant seals is essentially a lek, and once again, males compete for positions on the beach. In many cases, those positions are good quality positions because they have lots of females, but the end result is that you will sometimes see, depending on the lek, you will see one particular bull elephant seal that makes up as many as 95% of the matings on that beach. So the distribution of paternity is very, very skewed towards one or a few individuals. All right, let's kill it here. So why do these males aggregate? And there are a bunch of reasons that are presented in your book, and we will go through those next week. Didn't need your book after, because we didn't get that far. Questions? Your final is comprehensive. So you took a pretest at the beginning of the semester. Hopefully you didn't save any knowledge of that pretest. So the comprehensive portion of the class will be you basically just retaking that pretest, only this time you'll take it for a grade. It should have everything on it that we covered throughout the semester. I'll review it before the end of the semester, make sure that we still covered everything that's on it. We're actually ahead of schedule compared to where we usually are, so I may have to add some things to that pretest to make it comprehensive. But then again, I might not, because it seems like we have a lot of days when we're not meeting over the next month. And then the written portion of the test will be a test just like any other test that you've taken, and it'll just be what we've covered since the last exam. So there will be a written portion that is just this material, and then there will be a comprehensive portion which is online on Socrative. And then those will be combined together into your final exam grade. That way I can assess how well you've learned the material here at the end. And I can also, what I do with those pre-test, post-tests is I use those to kind of ask, well, where were you at the beginning of the semester in terms of what you knew and understood about animal behavior, and what kind of progress have you made over the course of the semester? I don't off the top of my head, but at the bottom of the schedule, it's posted there. I don't either. I suspect that I will have that. It's when? May 12th, which is a. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, the last week of classes, that will be more in the forefront of my mind. As I'm sure it will be more in the forefront of your mind.
If it was earlier in the week, I was probably going to want to move it from.
Okay, yeah.